School voucher programs have swept across the U.S. over the past decade or so. They're also known as education savings account, school choice. These programs basically allow families to use public funds, taxpayer funds, to pay for private school tuition. Recently, they've become especially popular in red states, including Texas, where Republican Governor Greg Abbott has been pushing hard for several years for a school voucher program to be implemented in the state of Texas. When it wasn't implemented in 2023, he even took the step of going out and campaigning against members of the Texas House of Representatives who voted against the voucher program. It seems to have worked. In 2025, it looks like Governor Abbott may finally have the numbers to pass school choice into law. So with all that background, today I'm talking with Christopher Kulesa, a scholar in child health policy at the Baker Institute, to explore the impact school vouchers could have on Texas K-12 education and education in general, and what lawmakers should be thinking about if they want to design a fiscally responsible voucher program. I am Ed Emmett, current fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and also a former member of the Texas House of Representatives. And this is Baker Briefing. Chris, thanks for joining me today to talk about this timely topic.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, let's start with a fundamental question. When did school vouchers first appear as an idea?
They stretch back quite a few decades. If we're looking at school vouchers as a major concept, really looking back to the 1950s, starting out with Milton Friedman. In 1955, there was a paper that was published as an idea to provide public schools more funding and to give parents more of a choice using that free market approach. In Texas, it's something that has been popping up over the decades ever since. But lately, you can say that the real push for school vouchers really started a couple sessions ago, particularly on the state Senate side. The first time that we really had a serious proposal pass out of one of the chambers was during last session, but it was really difficult to get it through the state House of Representatives. Now, as some of the things that you mentioned, we have a bit of a changeover in the membership of the House. It looks more likely that we're going to see it pass this upcoming session.
Before we talk about Texas specifically, who actually were the original proponents of vouchers? It's my understanding that, in fact, it was largely minority communities in the North who thought their kids didn't have the option of getting out of the inner city schools, and now it seems to have moved completely to the other end of the political spectrum, conservative Republicans.
100%. So there was a bit of a mix of different groups that had different motivations as to why they wanted school vouchers. But one of the key groups was indeed those in the North, right, that were looking to provide expanded education for minority low-income populations. So what we started seeing in the early 1990s were these smaller targeted pilot programs in urban areas to try to improve test scores and other academic achievement outcomes. And there was some evidence that indeed those smaller programs started to work. But those were voucher programs in the traditional sense, where more money was given directly from the government or the fiscal agency down to the schools. There wasn't as much of a national trend getting them at the state level through the 1990s and the 2000s. It wasn't very successful. So there was a bit of a pivot within the movement that wanted to get these changed to go from more of a voucher program to an ESA program, which is something that we're seeing more commonly discussed today.
ESA being Education Savings Account.
Exactly right.
So approximately how many states have enacted school voucher programs, and how do those differ?
So right now we have over 30 states that have some form of school choice, and they are quite diverse in the ways that they look. So you have the traditional voucher programs, or what we think about. We also have tax credit programs where you simply are able to get a certain amount of tax credits from the state government for enrolling your students. But then we have these education savings accounts that are really popping up in the past couple of years. And the idea behind those is giving parents the choice to decide. So they don't have the ability to just use it on private education tuition expenses, but they can also use it on things like supplies, tutoring, or it could be some other expense that's somewhat related. So you really see now the explosion of programs around these ESAs.
So is it safe to say that voucher programs in those 30 states vary widely?
They do vary widely.
So what's being proposed in Texas, and what have been the arguments against it that have kept it from becoming law?
Right. So the Texas program is an ESA program, and it's modeled somewhat after Arizona's universal program. And with this, the program that is being proposed right now would cap at $1 billion in terms of expenses, and it would allow open enrollment, and 80% of the enrollees, if it hits that cap, would be required to be low-income families as it's determined by the law. However, low income means 500% of the federal poverty line. So for a family of four, that's about $160,000 a year. Once it hits that, the remaining 20% will be for everybody else, and it'll be a part of a lottery system. The arguments against it actually somewhat come from the experience of places like Arizona, where they thought the program was going to be in the tens of millions of dollars. But as enrollment kept increasing and enrollment was far above and beyond what they projected, the cost of the program ended up being over $400 million. On top of that, too, there's concern that you're really taking money away from the public education system, particularly in rural areas. And that's where the Republican legislators that voted down the measure in the last legislative session were largely coming from, those rural areas where they really don't have many private schools. They really only have access to public education.
Well, one question that's come up, speaking about the rural areas particularly, is this going to have any impact on homeschoolers?
It could. It does indeed allow for homeschoolers to tap into the program and get $2,000 if it's SB2, which is what the Senate is considering right now. The House of Representatives came out with the program. I haven't had, unfortunately, as much time to look at it, but their funding mechanism is a bit different. I would expect to see some sort of increase in the amount of homeschoolers. Particularly, we have to consider the impact that COVID-19 had and just the general trend in terms of thought about public education among more conservative-leaning voters these days.
So you mentioned SB 2, that's Senate Bill 2. The fact that it is designated Senate Bill 2 means it's pretty much the top priority of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. It
is, and in the House of Representatives, the number from what I saw was House Bill 3. So it's top priority, and the new speaker has said that it is a top priority and that they are for sure going to get it through. And in fact, they appointed again the same chair for the committee that's going to be overseeing it from last term, Buckley, and he is very in favor of education choice.
Let's talk about some of the other states, how it's worked, but there's also been some ballot initiatives where the public was asked, what do you think about school choice or school vouchers? What can you tell us about those? Have they passed? Have they failed? What have been the arguments?
They have generally failed. So looking at places like Kentucky that recently had a proposal on the ballot, and millions of dollars get poured into these on both sides. But when it comes down to the ballot initiatives themselves, you do have periods of time where you find that people on paper are in favor of having some kind of school choice program or some kind of system where they're able to send their kids to private school. But when it comes down to the campaign season itself, the messaging, those that are opponents of the program can very easily say that this program is going to take money away from teachers and public schools, and that resonates very, very well with voters. So when the voters go into a ballot, they're having to think about, well, the information that I have, it's been time and time again said this is going to take money away from public schools. So they end up voting no, and it ends up going down. So we end up seeing this even in very conservative states, even places where Donald Trump ran up his numbers quite high, who's indeed in favor of programs like this.
So clearly the leadership in Texas, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker, they're aware of that argument. So what's in the legislation to answer the question or answer the allegation that vouchers take money away from public schools?
They have tried tying it with increases in education for public schools. So that was one of the things that they tried doing in the last legislative session. They put it in a package to say, if indeed you pass this school choice program, we are going to increase teacher salary and we're going to increase support. And indeed, Governor Abbott, during his State of the State address, made increasing teacher salary one of his priorities, one of his major priorities. So that's been one of the things that has been used to try to reduce the fear that there's going to be money taken away. And indeed, Texas has a large surplus to be able to do both programs, right? Fiscally, right now, we are okay, and we could fund public schools and create an ESA program. With that being said, it just hasn't been enough to get some of those that are against it to really shift some of their votes.
Of course, I learned a long time ago not to assume anything with the Texas Legislature, but if there's a safe bet this year, it is that some form of school voucher is going to pass. And you used the figure $1 billion. How many families does that actually cover?
That would cover about 100,000 students. So also thinking...
And how many students are there in the state of Texas?
Right. There are millions. And it's about 6% of our population right now, of our student population that attends private schools. The fear, however, is that, for one, the average private education per year is somewhat above the amount that would be given by the proposals that are currently on the table, looking at about $11.5 thousand for an annual tuition for private schools. What we have seen in some states is once the program gets implemented, there's a creeping up of tuition because they know that with certain families that the tuition is being subsidized. So there's a little bit of a fear that indeed that there could be some inflation in terms of tuition. On the other side is that 70% of those families that tend to use programs like this already have kids in private schools. Now, to alleviate that fear, the Texas Legislature is really thinking this time around about making it a targeted program, right? Really making sure that it's getting to families that really ultimately need it. Those families that are low income, disabilities, and have other determining factors. But again, we'll have to see what happens with the budget. And of course, that number was very, very high in terms of family income to qualify.
Since we're early in the legislative session, I know things are in a state of flux, but if their child is already in private school, are they eligible? I've heard some comments that it's only for those who are going to be new to private schools.
Right. So they have tried putting in the fact that it would be for those that are new to private school or those that are first enrolling, right, to try to create some kind of a protection mechanism to make sure. There's some that still question whether or not that might be the case, particularly with that extra 20% and what the bill might end up being at the end of the day. And we still are getting details from the House of Representatives side. But right now, they have tried putting in those certain protections to make sure that it's new students moving from the public education system into private school.
So who would actually receive the money? Will it be the parents of the student, or will it be the school that the student enrolls in?
It would be primarily the parents that would be able to use the money, because in ESA programs, those are generally vouchers plus. So an ESA program, it's not just tuition that you're talking about. And certain states have tried using different mechanisms to try to keep the program spending money on what it's supposed to. So, for example, you're talking about New Hampshire that has an electronic system where it tracks how the money is being spent. Now, for Senate Bill 2, it does have a provision within it that says the comptroller will be auditing the program on a regular basis to make sure that the money is being spent on what it's supposed to. And in order for schools and child care providers to qualify, they have to go through a qualification process before that so that they can open up to these resources. Because what we've seen in some other states also is new private schools popping up so that they can collect money from the voucher system. But their academic qualifications just simply aren't there.
We're living in a time right now where there's a lot of attention on government waste, particularly at the federal level. And here we're going to have a program that gives $1 billion out to households across the state of Texas. Let's dive a little bit more into it. And it's fine to say the comptroller is going to audit the program, but what's going to be the size of a voucher roughly?
So that depends. So if you're looking at those that are not having students that are special needs or have some disability, that would be $10,000. Then it goes up to $11,500 for those families with disabilities per year. So it's a pretty significant amount of money. But that has really been the question, because there are certain states where there really isn't a lot of oversight, and you end up finding that this money is being spent on things that only on the periphery really may count for as an education expense. So it's going to be ultimately important for the Texas Legislature to figure something out, while also balancing out the calls from the advocates to say this is supposed to be parental freedom. And indeed, that is something that gets talked about that among certain conservative circles is this really just a way for certain government agencies to get their hands more involved in private education? And you saw some opposition with some Texas legislators saying, well, no, this isn't education freedom at all. This is really just for the Texas government to start meddling in private education. So that was a really interesting, I will say, argument from some of them.
It hasn't been that many years. Well, actually, it's been quite a few years since I was in public school, but there weren't that many private schools around. And in Texas, we've seen the growth of private schools, many of which are church-related, certainly in the last couple of decades. Do you think that this would lead to an explosion in the number of private schools? And the ancillary question that follows that is, what about the public schools? Who's going to be leaving the public schools, going to the private schools, and who's going to be left behind at the public schools? And is there going to be a disparity in education?
That's a really good question. And it's ultimately going to come down to what the design of this program looks like. You do have the complexities of students leaving public schools, and our funding system in Texas for public schools is dependent upon enrollment. So if you have a good proportion of students leaving those public schools, you could have an issue with the formula if there isn't additional money given to try to fill that gap. And indeed, there have been amendments provided to try to hold the schools harmless for their decrease in enrollment, and they haven't necessarily gone much of anywhere. What you are likely to see is a number of parents that are, of course, already in the private school system trying to use the resources, right, as we've seen in other states. But those parents that have resources, that can afford that tuition and afford that premium that isn't covered, largely leaving the public education system. With how many new private schools that might pop up, there has been an argument made, in fact, even to counter the arguments that rural legislators were saying that we don't have any private schools. They actually say the popping up of more private schools would be a good thing to be able to capture those students that may not have access. The issue is in urban areas or some other areas where you might have a private school that pops up that really just doesn't have that type of credentialing, and you really could end up having an explosion like we've seen in some other states.
Well, and of course we mentioned homeschooling earlier. Would the state come in and somehow make a judgment as to whether or not the homeschooling qualifies for the voucher?
So I would expect that there wouldn't be too much of a change in terms of homeschooling policy, in terms of curriculum and whatnot. However, I should mention that one of the things that they're trying to do to keep this as an accountable program is that those students that are moving on to the vouchers will now have to be taking either the state testing or some other type of standardized exam so that then they would be able to track it. So a lot of the private schools, for example, use out-of-state testing like the Iowa exam to try to use that as a proxy for something like the STAR testing scores.
One more question about homeschooling.
Yeah.
I've seen a phenomenon lately where several families who homeschool will get together, sometimes in a strip mall, shopping center, and they'll hire a teacher. Will that kind of a homeschool setup qualify?
That is a good question. I am not sure, to be honest with you, for that. I think that there are still some questions involved as to what that might look like, but it very well could under certain circumstances. I know models like that became very common during COVID-19, especially when kids started pulling out of the private schools with COVID. So I would expect that under certain circumstances, yes, a model like that could very well qualify in a program like this.
So I think at this point, it's safe to say that the education system in Texas, if this bill passes, is going to change. But is it also safe to say we don't really know exactly how it's going to change?
That's exactly correct. And one thing that I should note, too, is that testing scores are oftentimes used as a metric to see how well voucher programs are doing in other states. Very oftentimes, private schools don't teach directly to those tests. They have other metrics in terms of what academic performance and achievement looks like. So it's not always comparing, apples to apples. You're comparing apples to oranges. They're still fruit at the end of the day, but they are a little bit different to wonder whether or not you're really measuring the same thing or the same type of achievement.
Well, we have two dilemmas here. One, we're almost out of time. But second, we're so early in the legislative session that we don't know for sure what's going to pass. So I think it's almost certain that we'll have to have a follow-up session with you, Chris, once the legislation does pass, and we can say, okay, now what?
Yeah, that would be excellent because you're right. We have quite a few different dynamics at play between the House and the Senate, and now the House just came out with its version. So it'll be really fascinating to see how this all plays out.
And I suppose there could be a court test?
Of course, as always.
As always. Chris, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
This has been enlightening, and we maybe raised more questions than we provided answers, but it will be fun to follow. For more on the topic of school vouchers, I encourage you to read Chris's brief, How to Design a Fiscally Responsible School Choice Program in Texas. A link is available in the show notes. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zimmel with support from Grayson Beaubien. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more, and thank you for listening.